He said in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-4, I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. There's what Brother Mark was saying. According to the Scriptures. He didn't just die, and we don't know if that was God's will. He died as an act of God's will, according to the Scriptures. That's a pretty important thing. So we trust in the Scriptures, but I'm going to give you, as I said, other reasons. He goes on to say that he was buried and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. So notice both times he says according to the Scriptures. His death was according to the Scriptures, which means it fulfilled prophecy. And by the way, you're talking about prophecy that not only was, in the case of the 22nd Psalm, David lived right around 1,000 years before Christ. If he wrote the 22nd Psalm somewhere in that neighborhood, you're talking about over 1,000 years before Jesus came. The Spirit of God came upon David, and he just went right down through some of these Psalms and gave the insight into what was going to happen to Jesus. Things like piercing his hands and his feet in the 22nd Psalm. Another interesting thing to take into consideration, the Persians were principally the ones who created what we think of as crucifixion. The Romans, some historians wrote it like this, the Persians created it, the Romans perfected it. And that's not a good example of something you want perfected. They made it worse. The whole idea of what they were trying to do is make it more painful, more lasting, more brutal. But the Persians weren't doing that at the time of David, which means David didn't have any background when he saw that vision to be describing what was a crucifixion. There wasn't any crucifixion to describe at that time in history, which lets you know somebody with more insight than David that could look forward in time and see what was going to happen was giving you the insight, the prophecy. So he died according to the Scriptures, just like the Scriptures described he would. Not just that he would die, but how the Scriptures described he would die. And then he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. But one of the other evidences I think is pretty interesting is that Jesus did not die some hyperbolically heroic death. Hyperbolic is when you exaggerate something for effect, you know. The Bible uses hyperbolic statements. When it says all Judea came out to be baptized of John, every single person in Judea didn't. So it's a hyperbolic statement that isn't intended to be deceiving at all. It just means from all over Judea, or it's like everybody in Judea was coming, but you know every single person didn't. So hyperbole is a normal literary device, but there's no hyperbole in the description of Jesus' death. He wasn't up on the cross declaring curses on people, and he just broke free. I've always loved this Cathedral song. I don't know who originally wrote it. I don't think, Loretta, I've ever seen it anywhere, written down like in a songbook, or that I've ever heard us sing it, not that we have to. It's a very interesting song that years ago I got a collection, back when CDs were more prevalent, that had all the Gaithers CDs. It was probably like 20 CDs or something, this real nice collection. I saved up my money for it because I love not the Gaithers, the Cathedral Quartet, Cathedrals. And one of their songs on there is He Didn't Come Down. It was a pretty powerful song. I'm not going to try to sing it for you tonight. My throat's still pretty gravelly. I wouldn't know if I'd do it anyway. But it says, He didn't come down. Praise God, He didn't come down. 10,000 angels stood all around. And it goes on to talk about how He could have called them to set Him free, but He stayed on the cross for you and for me. Well, He certainly had the power that He could have demonstrated some great heroic act where He could have just knocked them flat. God gave Him a little bit of that just to let everybody know what they were dealing with when they tried to grab Him in the garden, didn't He? When He said, I'm the one, and they went out flat. It didn't stop the process, but it sure made a point, didn't it? That you're not taking Him except at God's allowance. Because God could have laid the whole world out flat if He wanted to stop them affecting His Son. So I think it's interesting that the description of His suffering isn't, I'll use that phrase again, hyperbolically heroic. In other words, it doesn't describe this great hero from the standpoint of, say, the myths and legends of the ancient world, someone that breaks their chains like a Hercules, or does some great heroic act that's some military victory, or brings down fire and brimstone on their enemies while they're trying to hang them on the cross, or, by the way, even is able to carry that crossbar. It's almost certain the images you see in some of the documentaries or films that have been made about the crucifixion of Christ, where He's carrying the big lowercase T-shaped cross, is not accurate. Almost always, they already had the vertical post in the ground, and they had to carry that cross post. And they carried the cross post up, and then they would lift them up and drop them down. In fact, most men could never have carried that whole cross, especially after they'd been beaten. And that was standard fare for a crucifixion. You got beaten first. There's a reason. It's pretty gruesome. They wanted to completely destroy your back. I mean, where it was ribbons of flesh. The skin was pretty much removed. So when you were up against that cross, it wasn't a sanded, smooth piece of wood. It was a rough timber. It's dreadful, okay? It's horrific. But I love how Gerald Crabb, I think it is, that wrote that, where he said, 2 pieces of rough timber on a hill, talking about the cross. It wasn't sanded wood. It was rough, splinter-filled timber. And imagine your back being entirely lacerated, having to scoot up and down on that just to breathe. All of it was intended to be absolute torture. I'll come back to the crossbeam in just a minute, but you start going through the pieces of what Jesus endured that last 24 hours through the cross. No one in their right mind will argue that he lived through this experience. It's amazing he lived as long as he did. The fact that he lived as long as he did is astonishing. The fact, as I said, and to me this is one, I've never heard a minister bring this up. I'm sure many have. It did not originate with me. I heard someone say this. But I think it's very interesting, if you know how dreadful that asphyxiation is that you're going through on a cross, that he was capable of saying as much as he did on that cross, which just lets you know just how important his words were. They weren't casual words. It took everything he had to say those 7 statements he said on the cross. It probably caused him incredible pain to have to say them because he wouldn't have the time to take in the breath again, and he'd be smothered again after he let those words out. He had no time to take in a breath or to breathe out like he needed to. So I think the fact that he's not presented as some, now mind you, he is presented as a great hero if you understand the battle that he's fighting. But from the standpoint of the ancient world and their concept of heroes, even the standpoint of the Jews who were expecting a conquering king, he didn't look like a great hero. He looked like he lost the battle. When he won his greatest victory is when it looks like he lost his greatest defeat. What looks like the greatest defeat he could possibly face was the greatest victory in all the history of the universe. Praise his holy name. That's how opposite God's economy is from man's economy. It's the foolishness of God, see? The wisdom of man can't comprehend it. Why would you let your son, this mighty warrior, the one the scripture refers to as the Lion of the tribe of Judah, why would you hang that lion on a tree? Because a lamb had to die for the sins of man. And only one lamb would do. God was never a lamb. One other thing you'll find very interesting as you go through some of the elements of the crucifixion, not just the things that happened, but the statements about it in the Bible and the Old Testament statements, is you will definitely not be able to see the Godhead the same way if you actually are reading and hearing what you're reading, which is astonishing because many millions of people have read right through it and you're missing some simple points that completely decimate some views of the Godhead. So I think there's authenticity and plausibility in the story. It's very different. I'd said it's one of my arguments for why the Bible is valid, one of many, is that it's not the kind of book somebody would write about their heroes. If David was your hero, some of the things in his life were not something you'd want to tell anybody. You might be better off just being quiet about it, not advertising. If you want him to be considered a great hero, Moses the same. All of them had things. Well, not all of them. There were some men. Isn't that a testimony? You're going to have a hard time finding something in Joseph. You're going to have a hard time finding something in Daniel. Let's use Daniel, because Daniel to me is the prime example. I don't know how you could get any higher than Daniel under the Old Covenant. I don't know how you could get any higher. That doesn't mean you couldn't get higher. I said under the Old Covenant. Under the Old Covenant, Daniel was up against that glass ceiling that the Jews were under. They were under their own glass ceiling. He was pressed up against the ceiling, I think, almost all his life. But that wasn't the kind of description. It didn't have some great heroic description. It was a pretty brutal description. It's not the kind of thing you'd want to tell about your heroes. As I said, that's one of the reasons the Bible is such an interesting book, because it's not the kind of book, I think I heard someone say it like this, it's not the kind of book men would write if men were the ones writing it. If you're going to try to be convincing the world that the nation of Israel is the chosen people of God and superior to everyone else on the planet, at least up to a point in time, you surely wouldn't include some of the history you got in there. You know how people selectively deal with history, right? Some things, some defeats. You look at almost all the ancient kings, very few of them ever recorded their defeats. I've heard atheists argue that, there's no record in the Egyptian chronicles of what happened in the Exodus. Oh, I'm sure you're probably never going to find one. They've got plenty of records all around that time, But somehow there's this big gap there where they weren't talking about any victories. In fact, if you look at the time after what happened in Egypt and you get your chronology right, there's a lot of archaeologists who have had some odd ideas about chronology, but if you get it right, there's a whole gap after that time in the Egyptian chronology where they weren't conquering anybody. There was no great economic boom. It's because they had been flattened to the ground. But they weren't advertising that. They just didn't have anything to say about any victories because there weren't any victories to say anything about. The type of execution that he underwent, and the way his death was described, and even the nature of his burial make it certain that he truly died. The process of his last hours leading up to his crucifixion were pretty brutal. You know what might have been one of the most brutal parts of it? It was exhausting, of course, if you understand all that he did in that day. He knew it was coming. That's one of the most brutal things of all, is when you already know ahead of time it's coming, and you know how bad it's going to be. And you got to think about it. Imagine where his mind was. It's astonishing when you read the discussions he was having with his disciples in that last couple of days before his crucifixion, because he knew exactly what was coming, and he knew the timing of it, because it wasn't random. It wasn't just like God said, after you come up to the city sometime. I said we're in a season. He knew he was the Passover lamb. He knew he has to die by the time of the Passover. By that same period, he's got to die in the same period as the Passover sacrifice. So he knew what was coming. He knew when it was coming. That'd be a pretty rough thing to have to deal with ahead of time. It appears, if you read through the gospel records, that he didn't have any sleep the night before he was crucified. That doesn't help, does it, when you haven't had any sleep and you're already agonizing over something and exhausted? And then he went through an extremely intense spiritual and emotional struggle in the Garden of Gethsemane. I think it's in the 22nd chapter of Luke where it uses this word. I think King James translates the word agony. He was in agony. Is that how it says it? It's interesting because there's a number of words in the Bible that are used for pain or suffering or travail or something else. That's a very simple word to remember in Greek. It's agonia. It's where we get our word agony from. Agonia is only used one time in the entire Bible, right there. You almost wonder if God let a word get inspired that's only used once to let you know the level of what it was. It wasn't just suffering. That word usually refers to something that's an extreme state of suffering in your heart, in your mind, in your body. And of course, you know the story. I'm not going to go through all of it. I'm giving an overview with some of these evidences rather than reading through all these accounts, or we'd be here for a few weeks just going through this. But you know the story of how his disciples even fell asleep. All of the last part of his life, prior to the most brutal ending of the process, was heartrending. He knows it's coming. The clock is ticking, so to speak. He hadn't had any sleep. Judas leaves to betray him. And he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's pouring out his heart to God. And the only friends that he's got that have stuck with him, that are with him in the garden, can't even stay awake to comfort him. He was hurt over it. You can see it if you read between the lines. You don't even need to read between the lines. He was hurt. He says, you can't even stay awake with me for a little while? When he was suffering like he was, you think somebody would be like, my friend is suffering. I'm not going to lay down and go to sleep. But they were exhausted. Imagine how much more exhausted he was mentally, emotionally, and physically. They had no idea what was coming. He was telling them all kinds of mysterious things at the Last Supper, but they had no clue what was about to happen. Probably were wondering what in the world's going on with him in the garden that he's crying and straining out like this. That mysterious description of him sweating like great drops of blood, there's a medical condition called hematidrosis that it's very uncommon, but they've actually proven that this does occur when you're under such anxiety and stress that you literally break capillaries and blood will come out in your sweat. It's not heavy, but it causes the release of chemicals in your bloodstream that literally break down the capillaries and will cause, as I said, blood to come out in your sweat. So sometimes we've said that maybe was just like somebody bleeding. He was sweating so heavily. But it very well may be that the level of anxiety and stress he was under. Now, I want you to think about this. This was the Son of God. He obviously knew his Father loved him. I believe that he knew he had done everything his Father had asked. He said that a few times, didn't he? I certainly don't believe he lied about it. He said, everything my Father's asked me to say, I said. Everything my Father's asked me to do, I did. And yet the strain of what was coming was so bad, the anxiety apparently, if it's describing what it sounds like it's describing, literally caused chemicals to be released into his blood that caused his sweat to be tinged with blood. That tells you just the level of anxiety he was under. And then, of course, he'd already been betrayed by Judas, but then Judas appears and betrays him in person. And it wasn't just a smack in the face, it was a kiss on the face. I've said this many times to people who've been hurt in the church through the years. I don't mean this church, I mean any church, because people are hurt in churches, all right? Said you're going to have to reconcile that situation. You have to resolve it. Someone may need to apologize. Something may need to be corrected, whatever. But you're going to have to reconcile the situation because this is the family of God. But we all have to try to keep our spirit right and try to keep our relationships strong. And don't let any roots of bitterness climb into the garden. No little foxes eating away at the vines and no roots of bitterness growing under the ground. Little foxes are visible. You can see them working on the vines, and you can go over there and smack them in the head a few times or set their tail on fire or whatever you got to do with them. Roots of bitterness are invisible. Unless somebody lets the root out by getting around you and letting you hear what they have to say. But most of the time, that root's down in there working. We got to watch ourselves. We got to guard ourselves. And I do believe in a devil. There is nothing the devil would like more than to hit this church while it's moving forward. That's exactly what he likes best. He loves to slow down or stunt or stop the progress God is doing. There's only one thing that'll stop the progress of this church moving forward. It's us. Because if we keep doing what God wants us to do, it's going to keep moving forward. If we can keep our spirit right, it's going to keep moving forward. The devil cannot stop this church moving forward. It's only how we respond to the conditions, whether it's him causing them or someone else, that could potentially throw this church off. And then suddenly we're stopped or, God forbid, losing ground. It's up to us. And sometimes what's up to us might cost us something. It cost him something, didn't it? We've got to make sacrificial choices at times to continue on with the Lord, even when it's difficult to do. So Gethsemane was a pretty brutal process that he went through. And then the end of Gethsemane, of course, when betrayed by a kiss, as horrific as that is. There was no need for him to do that. That just added insult to injury. You know, he was taken through multiple trials. This is without sleep. This is exhausted. This is under terrible stress and anxiety. This is after he had poured out his heart. Have you ever had an experience like that where you poured out your heart for hours on end? I'll bet many of you had. I have. I've had some things that so ripped my heart out in terms of how much distress they were causing me that I literally was down on my face for hours crying out to God. Just like sometimes in a positive sense when you're worshiping for hours, when you come out of a prayer session like that, you're exhausted. You're not coming out refreshed. You're exhausted. He already hadn't slept. He already was under major stress. Then you got to go through 6 trials, 3 religious and 3 civil trials. He was tried for Annas, the former high priest. He was tried for Caiaphas, the current high priest, Annas' son-in-law. And then he was tried for the Sanhedrin. He was charged in those ecclesiastical trials with blasphemy, claiming to be the Son of God, claiming to be the Messiah. It's interesting how many people will say, bless the Lord. I told you I was going to throw in some Godhead points. Bless the Lord, he was claiming to be God, and that's why they killed him. They didn't even accuse him of that. If that's what he was claiming to do, you better believe they would accuse him of it. But that's not quite what they accused him of. That should tell you something all by itself. If you had a higher thing to accuse him of, surely you would have accused him of that. But they did accuse him of claiming some kind of special relationship with God, claiming to be the Son of God. Those religious trials, I think I mentioned this maybe the last time I was talking on this, just showed the degree of how much those Jews hated Jesus. Because they were so adamant about not breaking their customs and traditions. Every tradition had to be followed, the traditions of the fathers. We have to be very careful with that kind of language, where we talk about the traditions of the fathers. The traditions of the fathers can be wonderful or terrible, all depending on where the fathers got their traditions. See, I can make it real simple. Sometimes I get a little philosophical with it, and I'm doing that to be careful so I don't push buttons or hurt people outside this assembly. Other ministers perhaps that have a different view than this. But I don't even have to get real philosophical. I can be real simple. You want to know if a tradition of the Father is a good tradition or not? It all comes down to where they got it from. Isn't that simple? If they got it from the right source, it's a good tradition. If they didn't get it from the right source, it's not a good tradition. It could be maybe valuable in terms of practical living or something, but I'm talking about traditions that are critical traditions, necessary traditions. They had a number of traditions. None of these, well, I won't say none of them. Most of them aren't necessarily part of the Mosaic law, but they were traditions of the elders, traditions of the fathers about court cases. But I said when I started giving you some of these before, I said the Jews didn't even have the authority to pass the death penalty at this point. All they could do is refer it to the Roman government after they had said whatever they had to say. They couldn't just go out and kill somebody, which is kind of astonishing about those men trying to stone that woman to death, because they would have definitely been executed by Rome if they'd been caught doing it, because the Jews no longer had the ability to carry out the death penalty. They would have been accused of murder if they'd stoned that woman, if any of the Romans had been aware of it. But the accused had to be given counsel or a representative, according to their traditions. Jesus was given none. The accused wasn't to be asked self-incriminating questions. In other words, asked a question that would cause them to answer something that would incriminate them. They asked him if he was the Christ, didn't they? That was to them a self-incriminating question. It's kind of silly, because aren't you looking for your Messiah? What are you so upset if he says, I'm the one? That's what they spun into blasphemy, is how dare he say he's the Messiah? What are you going to do when the real one comes if you think he's not the real one? How would you know it's the real one? And again, back to what I said earlier, what more does he have to do to prove he's the real one? I actually heard some knucklehead, maybe you heard it too because it was on the news here not long ago, one of these people on one of these daytime talking heads shows, and there are some big-headed morons on this show. 4 or 5 people sitting around a table. You can start, it's not the 5 on the Fox. If it's 4 or 5 ladies, let's narrow it down. That doesn't make them knuckleheads, but these 4 or 5 certainly are. They're the biggest knuckleheads I've ever seen, and almost. Maybe there's some worse. One of them went on to say that, Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah. One of them said that here just lately. He said the Bible never has any claims that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. You aren't reading it for sure. He made it real obvious. What do you think it means when Peter says to him in Matthew 16, isn't it? He asks him, who am I? And Peter says, you are the Christ. That's the Messiah, Christ. That's a Greek word, Christos. He wouldn't have said that. Peter wouldn't have spoke Greek to him. He probably would have spoke Aramaic. But if he had spoken Hebrew, it's Mashiach is how you say Messiah in Hebrew. Mashiach. So he would have said, you're the Mashiach. And Jesus said, flesh and blood hasn't revealed it. Revealed what? He literally just admitted he was the Messiah the second he said that. He said, flesh and blood didn't reveal that to you, but God in heaven. So if you think he didn't tell me when he was the Messiah, you couldn't have gotten any clearer than that. But that was one of the things the Jews accused him of blasphemy. How dare you think that you're the one? Another thing is no trial was to be held during feast times. They're right in the middle of the Feast of Unleavened Bread when this is going on. No trial was to be held at night. You do understand all these trials occurred during the night. Each member of the court had to vote individually to convict or to acquit somebody. Now, you may say, well, didn't they do that? No, they didn't. If you read what it said there, they did it by acclamation. In other words, everybody agreed, yeah. It was like yelling out. As long as you got enough noise. I've always thought some of the voting that happens in some parliaments is a little odd. They're like, yay or nay, yay, nay. It's like, all right. Unless you got an electronic recorder that you can tell which one's louder, somebody's like, the yays have it, or whatever. That's how they did it. They literally all started yelling out. That's not how someone was to be convicted in a Jewish court. They were to be voted on. You had to individually decide that man's fate. You didn't get to just yell out or stand in the back and, I didn't yell, so blood's not on my hands, kind of like Pilate a little later. If the death penalty was given, a night had to pass before the sentence was carried out. That didn't happen either, did it? Only a few hours passed before the process began. And then his closest friends deserted him. And his most loyal disciple, if you want to call him that, he thought he was the most loyal disciple, denied him 3 times, as you know. Then he went through his trials before the Roman authorities. The charges brought against him in those civil trials, if you want to call them that, civil powers trying him, were different from those in the religious trials. They could care less. This may sound funny, but they'd care less if he claimed to be God or the Son of God or anyone. They had so many gods, they didn't care if you thought you were a god or the son of a god. What would they have cared about that? So they weren't going to prosecute him for that. What they were concerned about is that he was claiming to be king. That's why Pilate kept saying, are you a king? Do you have a kingdom? And Herod, That was all they cared about. They didn't want somebody claiming to be a king and causing civil unrest by civil war or something. He can claim to be God or some space invader or some other nonsense all he wanted. They could have cared less. He was a space invader, just not the kind of the video game. He invaded from another dimension for sure. But they could have claimed anything. The Romans didn't care about that. They weren't one bit worried about him claiming to be in some role as long as it didn't impact society, as long as it didn't cause them to have to worry about a rebellion of some kind. And he was tried before Pilate. As you know, Pilate found no reason to kill him and sent him back to Herod. Then Herod had him ridiculed, and wanting to avoid any political liability, he then sent Jesus back to Pilate. Then Pilate tried to appease the Jews by having Jesus scourged, and here is where the most brutal part of the process begins. You know the story. Pilate's wife had had some kind of dream or vision. She was very concerned that he not be involved in the execution of this man, and Pilate was uncomfortable in trying to get Jesus what you might call off the hook. I'm going to talk about this now. It's going to get heavier. What he did in scourging him was a brutal thing. But I think Pilate really believed if we beat the man so badly that he looks like death warmed over, the Jews will finally be satisfied with their bloodlust, and I don't have to execute him. We'll just beat him near to death and then show him to the Jews all bloody and beaten. And by the way, as we're going to talk about, sadly and unfortunately in a moment, the process of scourging by a couple of Roman centurions or legionaries or whatever the case might be was an extremely brutal process. A lot of people didn't live through the process, especially if they got carried away and went beyond what they were supposed to do in terms of force or how many lashes or whatever. So Pilate was willing, I think, you have to read between the lines, but I think Pilate was willing to brutally damage Jesus, shy of killing him, so that he wouldn't have to be responsible for his death and he could bring him out looking horrific and think that that'll be enough for the Jews. They'll say, yeah, that's good. As horrible as that is, but that wasn't enough for them, as you know. So he was brutally beaten and tormented. By the way, anybody that was a person of birth or of noble blood or even a free citizen of Rome was never beaten with these whips that had some of these things in them I'm going to describe in a moment. They were usually beaten with rods, which might sound worse, but it is definitely not worse. Getting beat by a rod would bruise you up pretty good. It might break your bones, but it would not do, unless you were beaten and beaten and beaten for a long time, what the scourge would do to an individual. They used whips of braided leather, and they didn't just tie things on the end of the whip where it would crack. They tied them along the whip so the whole length of it would catch you. They put usually two different things on the whips. They would put some type of bone or metal shards to cut, and they would put these metal balls. The metal balls, forgive me, were intended to do what amounts to the work of a meat hammer. They were to soften and thin out the skin, so then when those sharp shards hit, they'd tear easier. The goal was to remove as much skin off of the person as was possible. And there's a very shocking thing in the original language. When Peter talks about by his stripes we're healed, he's quoting Isaiah. That is the wound created by that kind of a lash. He doesn't say stripes in the original language. Peter uses the word in the singular, as if it was one great wound, such a terrible devastation to his back you couldn't even see the stripes. It was just one great stripe. I told you, these are things that I wouldn't normally just get into in some normal service, but once in a while, we need to remind ourselves. So they braided this leather with sharp shards of bone or metal and these balls that caused deep bruises or contusions that would break open with further blows, and they were supposed to soften the skin. I'm not going to go into detail with any of this, but they weren't just whipped on the shoulders. They were whipped from the shoulders all the way down the back of their legs. The goal was that by the time they got to the cross, their back and the back of their legs and just the back of their whole body would be so shredded that every move against that cross would be the most agonizing pain. Sometimes they whipped them so hard their spine was visible. And as I said, many people died long before they got to the cross because of the brutality of the scourging. At the very least, the victim would experience tremendous pain and very likely go into hypovolemic shock as well because they were losing a lot of blood. That's another thing to take into consideration for these folks that want to argue Jesus didn't die. He had been losing blood for hours from the beatings and things he had taken. Before he even was on the cross, he'd been losing blood for a while. You can't lose blood for very long before you start to go into shock. He clearly wasn't fully in shock on the cross, or he wouldn't have been able to say some of the things he did. I mentioned this statement in 1 Peter 2:21-25, for it says, "For even hereunto were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that you should follow his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who when he was reviled not again." He's quoting principally from Isaiah 53. "When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously, who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we being dead to sin should live unto righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. For you were as sheep going astray, but are now returned unto the shepherd and bishop of our souls." I was reading that earlier today. I was going through some of these scriptures, just praying and reading over some of them. And I looked at that in the original language. It's a singular word, by his stripe, by that great, terrible wound. And it just hit me. What does Peter say right after this? After that brutal statement, he ends it by saying that we're returned unto the shepherd and bishop of our souls. What a shepherd. What a shepherd to take the part of the sheep. He was no sheep, he was a shepherd. But he took on the form of a sheep so that he had to suffer in this kind of way.